And maybe starting specifically with the cost of basic income, because this is something that you've written about, and you actually mentioned is one of your more popular pieces, because people love to really dig into the cost. And what was so interesting about the paper you'd put out on it was the disparity you came to between the usual calculation people come up with for how much basic income costs and what you found is the actual or the real cost. So maybe you could kind of bring us up to speed a little on the cost accounting.
Yeah, well, basic income, you're giving basic income to everyone in society. And so people will very naively and sometimes disingenuously will just say, well, I'll just multiply the size of the basic income by the number of people who are going to get it and think that that is a meaningful cost figure. Mm-hmm. That's the gross cost. But the real cost figure is the net cost. The net cost takes into effect that we're going to have to raise taxes to do this. You got to, if you're going to increase spending by that much, you've got to have some new taxes. Otherwise, you'll have rampant inflation. So you're going to have to tax a lot of this back. And when you tax people, you have to look at, okay, they're receiving a basic income, but they're paying a tax. So those two things cancel each other out. They pay a tax in money. They receive a basic income in money. So what is effectively happening is you're going to their bank account and you're putting a number on a ledger saying, here is $1 in basic income and here comes $1 in taxes. And you're right back where you started. That is easily 2/3 and very probably 5/6 or more of what basic income ends up doing is that it's mostly we're paying ourselves. And it's not just the people at the upper end who are paying themselves, but people in the middle, people who are net recipients will pay themselves. And even people with very low income will very often pay some portion of their own income themselves. So what we need to do to find out what basic income really costs is say, those who end up paying more, all told, how much more do they pay? Which is virtually the same as those who end up receiving more in basic income than they pay in new taxes. How much do they receive? And those two are about the same. The difference is transaction costs, which if it's like Social Security will be about like 0.5% of the gross. So that's not going to be terribly expensive. You can almost ignore that. And when you look at when I look at that with some very simple calculations, I find that for the United States, the net cost of basic income is 2.95% of gross domestic product, which is only about $539 billion per year. That is less than a quarter of what we're spending on social spending today. And it's enough to eliminate official poverty. Official poverty is not the greatest measure, but at least will eliminate it. Now, that is really cheap. We're eliminating poverty through 2.95% of GDP. Now, this does not count the cost and benefits of mixing it in with the system. There's some additional costs of mixing in with the system, is that if you did it the way we model, some people would have very high marginal tax rates, even if their low tax rate is, even if their overall tax burden is low, if their marginal tax rate is very high, that can cause problems here and there.
Right.
But so that, and fixing that is going to cost money. Any way you fix that means the people at the upper end are going to have to pay more in dollars. But it also there's a benefit. You fix that, that means people in the middle and the low end are going to end up being better off. And so you get those marginal tax rates, and that will increase the cost. But you will decrease the cost because some parts of the existing welfare system can be replaced. I don't think all of it can.
Right.
But some of it can be replaced. So we're looking at $539 billion, which is about a quarter, maybe a little more than a quarter of transfer payments right now. So if I don't think you're going to be able to, you're not going to replace $539 billion worth of things, but you might be able to replace $200 or $300 billion of social spending per year with things like food stamps. Basic income is way better than current food stamps. And you could just say basic income or Social Security will give you the highest of whichever one. Or basic income doesn't count unless it's more than your Social Security.
Right.
So that saves you a very large amount of money right there. So basic income, in some ways it'll cost more, in some ways cost less, and I don't calculate these things. In the back of the envelope paper, I just count the cost of basic income in a vacuum is $539 billion a year, 2.95% of GDP. That's for a not very generous one that just barely gets people out of poverty. You want to move that up to a $20,000 a year basic income for adults and $10,000 for children, which will do much better than eliminating just official poverty. That will cost slightly less than 10% of GDP. I can't remember the dollar figure. I don't have it right in front of me, but slightly less than 10% of GDP.
Yeah. And so the number you came up with, the 539 billion, which yes, uses simplified models, but it does demonstrate kind of a ballpark idea. Contrast that against the usual cost estimate that you were mentioning people do. If you multiply the population of the US by 12,000, which would be the annual basic income rate under kind of the most popular proposals, you come up with a number that is north of $4 trillion. And then that's typically laughed at, and that shuts down the discussion. One thing just to clarify, to make sure I understand, it is true that in order to fund something like this, we would need to implement measures that would raise that much, the north of 4 trillion. Is that correct? And then your cost accounting is once that gets distributed back out, we need to include that distribution canceling out. But we do need to raise that much money. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, sure. We have to raise that money. Yeah, sure. We have to raise that money.
Right.
But it's really not hard to raise that money.
Right.
It's not hard to say on your income tax, say, here's a higher income tax, but here's a basic income.
Right.